Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day and thanks so much for joining me for another art video. So throughout the past few months, I've been receiving lots of questions on watercolor pencils as well as more requests for tutorials on this medium. So what I decided to put together to share with you guys this week is a sort of guide on this very versatile medium in which I'm going to be sharing a bunch of must-know information and my favorite tips so that you can progress faster with your watercolor pencil skills. So this video is going to be perfect for anyone just getting started with watercolor pencils, and I'm going to be going through a whole range of important topics with you guys, starting with an introduction to watercolor pencils, what they are. I'm going to be then moving on to talking about similarities and differences between watercolor pencils and traditional watercolor paint. I'm then moving on to talking about the must-have supplies that I always make sure to have on hand when I'm using watercolor pencils. Then I'm going to talk about why making time for swatching your watercolor pencils or your watercolor pencil set is so important and how I personally do it. I'm then going to be talking about 12 must-know techniques that I would highly recommend exploring and experimenting with for yourself. And finally, I'm going to be closing the video by offering my suggestions and my opinions on who I think watercolor pencils are more appropriate for, just in case someone out there is considering whether to invest in watercolor pencils or traditional watercolor paint. So as you can see, this video is going to be jam-packed with information on a whole range of topics pertaining to watercolor pencils. So I'm going to make sure to leave timestamps to the different parts of this video down below for you in the description box in case you'd like to jump to a specific part. Alright, so with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start talking about what watercolor pencils are. To begin, it's important to know that watercolor pencils are super different from traditional watercolor paint. And also, even though they may look like regular colored pencils, such as wax-based or oil-based colored pencils, they're really not, because what they have inside of that wooden casing, which may look like a regular colored pencil case, is pigment that is held together by water-soluble binders. So even though they share some characteristics with regular watercolor paint, such as the fact that they are water soluble and you're kind of using the translucency offered by the medium in combination with the white paper under the paint to give dimension to a piece, to create different values and textures. And even though they're very similar visually to regular colored pencils, the process of using them as well as a final product is very, very different. And sure, I mean, you could use regular watercolor paint with a very small amount of water to the point that it ends up looking like a watercolor pencil piece, or you could decide to use watercolor pencils with no water activation at all, which can end up looking like a colored pencil piece. And that's perfectly fine. There's no right or wrong way of creating art, or no better or worse way to use an artistic medium. But I think it's super, super important to explore the medium, to explore what the medium allows to its full capabilities, so that you can really open up your horizons and use it to its full potential, so to speak. And this way you can be fully aware of the medium's strengths and its weaknesses, so that you can mindfully, intentionally choose to use the medium when you are going to be creating artwork of a specific kind of subject. Maybe you're going to be working outside of your studio and you love it because it's more portable and more practical and just requires less of a mess. And also you are able to make mindful choices as to when you want to combine it with other mediums, because just as an example, filling in large spaces with watercolor pencils and bringing in water to create more painterly effects, it can be a lot more difficult than just using regular paint to fill in larger spaces, create large washes. I personally have ruined watercolor pencil pieces by trying to develop a background using watercolor pencils, and I totally regret it not having created the background using regular paint. And so for all of these reasons, I think it's just important to know about the medium and stretch yourself to explore the medium in and of itself so that you're then able to make more mindful choices. All right, so moving on from there, watercolor pencils are a painting and a drawing medium combined into one. So because of this, they are super versatile. They allow for a whole range of different effects and ways of using them. And they allow for both sketchier mark making techniques as well as more painterly techniques. However, even when we do bring in water to activate color that we've placed on paper, there's always likely going to be some amount of texture left behind when compared to using regular paint, unless you use some of the techniques that I'm going to be sharing later. Because of their water-soluble color, we can bring in a bit of water and a paintbrush to activate that color that we've placed on paper to brighten and or deepen it and create a bit of a painterly look. We can also create transitions between colors and blending effects by bringing in water. However, because that pigment, that core, is brought together by a water-soluble binder as opposed to a wax-based binder like Prismacolor pencils or an oil-based binder, when you're using watercolor pencils without activating it with water, it's a lot more difficult to create nice, smooth transitions and blending effects between your different colors or with your different colors. Because watercolor pencils are so portable and because they don't make much of a mess, they're easy to carry around and they're popular amongst urban sketchers, art journalers, and watercolor artists who like working outside or in different settings. Some artists may choose to use watercolor pencils without bringing in water at all. Others may choose to activate all of the color that they've laid down on paper with water, and others, much like myself, may choose to do a combo of both painterly effects as well as mark making. Also, some artists may decide to use them in a more explorational, expressive, or even abstract way, while others may decide to create tighter, more realistic pieces with them. So again, there is no right or wrong way to go about using watercolor pencils, but a vast array of different ways to create unique works of art. And what's cool is that you can discover what techniques work for you and the type of artwork that you want to be producing. Watercolor pencils can be used in combination with watercolor paint. For example, watercolor paint can be used to create large washes of color or a background, which can certainly be tricky and harder to do with watercolor pencils. And then pencils can be used for elements in the foreground or the middle ground, or to develop color in the main subject. Watercolor pencils can also be brought in at the end of the painting process to develop final details, textures, mark making, etc. in paintings that have otherwise been fully created with regular watercolor paint. All right, so after having said all that, let me go ahead and share this visual with you. I wanted to create this one for you guys who are just like me, very visual, and you prefer to see these differences in list form. I'm gonna go ahead and read the main characteristics, the main points that I've added into the watercolor pencil column for you. So number one, watercolor pencils are a drawing and a painting medium in one. Number two, they are less messy than watercolor paint and require less cleanup. Number three, they require less water throughout the process, and because of this, they tend to dry a lot more quickly than regular watercolor paint. The next point is that a lot of beginners getting started feel like they are more in control over their medium when compared to using paintbrushes. The next point is usually some amount of texture and marks will be noticeable at the end, at least in some amount, even when water is brought in to diffuse that color. Watercolor pencils may require brushes that have stiffer bristles so that you can move around the pigment, push it around on that paper. The next point is that watercolor pencils are super portable and very useful for painting outside of the studio or working on plein air pieces. The next point is they lend themselves for tighter, more detailed work. They require sharpening throughout the process, though this isn't to say that using blunter tips might not be helpful for certain techniques. I'm going to be talking about that later. The next point is they allow for the creation of expressive lines and marks, or adding expressive lines and marks into paintings. The next point is that because we're using a pencil with a sharp point most of the time, it's very important to avoid pressing down too hard on our watercolor paper because we can scratch or damage that paper, which we cannot take back. This next point is if you're activating your color with water, make sure that you are wetting or working with the lighter colors or the lighter sections first before moving on to the darker sections, because it's very easy to start pulling or expanding that darker color into lighter color areas and completely overpowering, overtaking, or covering up those lighter values, which are very much needed. Or at the same time, you can start merging colors together that you weren't necessarily intending to blend together and create mud or a color that you didn't want if you're not careful and don't clean out your paintbrush bristles between your different colors that you're activating. The next point is, of course, that there is this fun surprise element because we get to activate that color, and most often than not, it's going to look a lot darker and or a lot more vibrant than how that color looks when it is dry or hasn't been activated with water. And finally, just to finish this side up, watercolor pencils may be a great entry medium for beginner watercolor artists looking to expand or move on to regular paint. And I say may here because if you're a beginner artist who is looking to really progress your watercolor painting skills, your skills with regular traditional paint, using watercolor pencils may actually hold you back and keep you from advancing as quickly as you could advance, because as I said, these are very, very different mediums and there are different kinds of skills involved with each. This is not to say that you cannot make the transition, because you totally can, but I just think that it's important to acknowledge what your goals are and to not be afraid to push yourself with a medium because you feel it's going to be too hard. So I think if you're getting started with watercolor pencils because you like the medium, because you like the fact that you can draw and sketch simultaneously, and you like the versatility of it and the different techniques that you can combine in one same piece, then go for it. Awesome. There are even professional artists who use watercolor pencils. I don't even consider it to be a beginner medium or anything like that. However, if your goal is to get better at painting, at using paint brushes and using more water and developing water control and paintbrush control and all of that, then don't stay in the colored pencil phase too long. Okay, that's all I'm saying. It's important to know your goals. Traditional watercolor paint is, of course, a painting medium, and we usually require a mixing palette throughout the process to mix different colors together and also constantly alter and shift and change the water to paint ratios in our different color mixers along the way, depending on what it is that we're doing. Usually at least one water container is necessary. Some artists use up to 3 containers. A good amount of water is brought in throughout the process. Some artists use more wet on dry techniques, others use more wet on wet techniques. Some artists use a combo of both, but usually the amount of water is more than when using watercolor pencils. Another thing is with watercolor paint, brushes with softer bristles that are able to hold and absorb a good amount of water and paint are preferable than stiffer paintbrushes that are not able to hold too much water and paint in their bristles. Another key point about watercolor paint is that it's a lot easier to fill up large spaces or areas with paint when compared to pencils, and also to create wet on wet effects. Of course, with paint, there is a greater amount of water control involved. We need to build up that skill. Watercolor paint usually requires more supplies and more cleanup. Just like with watercolor pencils or any other artistic medium, you can create very tight, highly detailed, even hyper-realistic pieces using watercolor paint, as well as looser, more expressive, more abstract even pieces. This all comes down to using specific techniques and to the particular artist's style and her or his way of working. However, because of pencils' inherent characteristics, they lend themselves more easily to tighter, more controlled, detailed work. When it comes to using traditional paint, this medium really lends itself more easily because we bring in more water and because of the medium's consistency in and of itself and the fact that we're using paintbrushes, we're able to more easily create more expressive, looser, more organic kinds of effects. And you've probably noticed by now that a lot of watercolor artists, they incorporate a lot of abstraction into their pieces and most frequently than not, leave out certain amounts of detail. Next point is that usually when we're creating a full watercolor painting, different kinds of paintbrushes and different sizes of paintbrushes are usually brought in throughout the process. And finally, when it comes to watercolor paint, a lot of traditionally trained artists prefer to stay away from the use of ready-made blacks such as ivory black, lamp black, Mars black, etc., because they tend to be pretty flat and dull. And a lot of watercolor artists prefer creating their own dark color mixtures. I'm gonna make sure to leave a link to a video that I created on this down below in the description box in case you'd like to learn more about that. All right, moving on to the similarities between the two mediums before moving on to the next part of this video. So both mediums are water soluble and require working on appropriate paper that's intended for water soluble mediums. Another thing is that it's super helpful to work from lightest colors towards darker colors or lighter values towards darker values. It's also important to plan for lightest light areas if you want to add dimension to your piece and avoid flatness and heaviness. Another thing is that the supplies needed for both mediums are quite similar. Another key thing here that applies for both mediums is that if an initial pencil sketch is created prior to getting started with the color work, it has to be done quite lightly if you don't want to see your graphite pencil work through your color. Another key thing is that higher quality pencils or higher quality paint lead to greater color payoff and more vibrancy. Another thing is that both mediums have learning curves to them, so do not expect to be a total master if you've been just working with either for a day or a week. And really, which one comes easiest for you is going to depend on your own personal strengths and weaknesses and what you like and what you don't like. Another thing is that both realistic / tighter and more expressive / looser results can be achieved with both via different techniques and processes. Another thing is that it's super important to stay on top of water control with both and allow layers to dry in between applications. This is super important because we're working on paper, and even though this is paper that is intended for water soluble mediums, it needs to be allowed to dry to regain its strength in between layers. And finally, just to finish this up, lifting is a technique that can be used to fix mistakes, at least to a certain degree, and I'm going to be sharing this technique with you in a later part of this video. Moving on to the next part of this video, in which I'm going to be sharing about the supplies that I always make sure to have on hand when I am creating work with watercolor pencils. So as I mentioned before, it's super important that if you're looking to bring in any amount of water, that you're working on paper that is intended for water-soluble mediums. And I enjoy using cold press paper. However, it's important to just know that cold press paper really varies from brand to brand. For example, right here, I'm sharing a sheet from Canson's Heritage 140-pound cold press paper pad, and right below it, I have a sheet from Strathmore's 140-pound cold press paper. Hopefully you can see through the screen how Strathmore's paper, the one at the bottom, has a lot less texture than Canson's paper at the top, and they're both cold pressed paper. Some artists enjoy using hot pressed paper, which has the least texture of all when it comes to watercolor paper. However, because I do a lot of watercolor painting with traditional paint, I always have cold pressed paper around because it's what I use when I am using regular paint. So I just go for the paper that has less texture to it. Why? Because when I am going to be using pencils in and of themselves will lead to a greater amount of visual texture. And when I use them on paper that in and of itself is very textured, the tip of the pencil is going to skip over that tooth a lot more, and even more texture is going to be created, and little tiny specks of paper are going to be left shining through the color, probably even more than I want to have. So because Strathmore's cold press ready cut sheets tend to have less texture to them, I just pick those whenever I'm going to be working with watercolor pencils. Whatever watercolor paper you decide to go for, just remember that its texture or tooth is going to have a huge impact on both your process as well as your final product. And also its thickness may make the process a lot easier and less frustrating for you if you go for a midway weight or thickness, so at least 140 pounds or heavier, because the thinner the paper, the more fragile that paper is, especially when it's wet, and you can damage it very easily. Also, the thinner the paper, the easier it'll warp and buckle when you start applying water on it. Alright, so aside from my watercolor paper, if I am going to be creating a full piece, especially if I want a white border around my piece, I tape my watercolor sheet down onto some sort of backing board. Sometimes I just use my black cutting mat, which I'm showing right here on screen under these supplies. And other times I tape my watercolor paper down onto some other thick cardboard or something along those lines. Before taping down my watercolor paper, I always run my pieces of masking tape over my clothes 3 to 4 times in order to soften that adhesive and make it a lot less likely that I'll damage my paper at the end when I remove it. I just like using regular 1-inch masking tape, but you can also use artist tape or even washi tape to create those white borders. You're going to need a container with water or a water fillable brush, a couple of paper towels or some sort of absorbent towel so that you can stay on top of water control and also do any lifting that might need to happen throughout the painting process. In terms of paintbrushes, you can either use a water fillable brush, which are awesome for when you're working in plein air or in different settings outside of the studio. When it comes to regular brushes, it totally depends on what it is that I am painting and if I am adding in some sort of background or not. If I am going to be adding in a background or I'm going to be painting larger areas, and I make sure to have larger brushes on hand, like the 1-inch flat brush that I'm sharing right here on screen, or some sort of larger mop brush. And when I am working on a piece in which I'm not really going to be adding in a background, or there's just a small amount of cast shadow involved or something like that, I can get away with using a couple of medium-sized round brushes like a 6 and an 8, and maybe one smaller detailing brush like a 2 or a 1. Personally, I use a regular sharpener to sharpen my watercolor pencils, but I do know that a lot of artists out there enjoy using some sort of crafting knife to sharpen their watercolor pencils because a regular sharpener can sometimes just use up too much product or chip or break either the wooden section or case of the colored pencil or the color in and of itself. So that's going to be up to you to decide what you'd like to use to sharpen your pencils, which you're probably going to have to do quite a bit throughout the process. And finally, I always have at least one HB drawing pencil on hand and a soft graphite eraser because I almost always get started with creating some sort of freehand preliminary pencil sketch before getting started with the addition and the development of color. And finally, I always have at least 1 or 2 scrap pieces of watercolor paper on hand in order to plan and prepare my colors. And my scrap pieces of watercolor paper, if you're wondering, they are just either cheap watercolor paper that I buy separately or old paintings that didn't turn out, that I didn't like, that I just cut up into pieces. And that is it in terms of my supplies. All right, moving on to the next part of this video, in which I am going to be explaining why it's important to swatch your watercolor pencils or your watercolor pencil set, as well as how I personally like going about swatching my watercolor pencils. So the reason why taking time to do your swatching before using your colors for a piece is because the color that appears on the wooden casing of each pencil and even the package of the set that you buy or whatever it is, most often than not, it's not going to be fully representative of the color that comes out when you're actually using the product. And another thing is that, as I mentioned before, color may look quite different when you actually activate it with water. So it's super helpful to just test that out, see how the color changes when you actually activate it with water, especially if that's something that you're intending to do in your painting process. So I always take time to do some quick swatching, and then when I'm done, I allow my page to dry completely and I store it for reference for future pieces. As I mentioned in past watercolor painting tutorials and also watercolor pencil painting tutorials, I always make time to plan, to pre-select my colors that I'm going to be using for a new piece. And having this sort of swatch sheet is super helpful when I am doing that. All right, so what I am doing right here is I am swatching my 12 pencils that come in my Derwent watercolor pencil set right here on this watercolor paper pad. As you can see, I created 12 little rectangles for myself, and I am going in with each color, filling the top section, the top third of that rectangle with slightly more pressure and more overlapping than the section in the middle. And then the bottom third, I am leaving completely free of any color. I don't ever really exert too much pressure on my watercolor pencils because I don't like to scratch or even start burnishing my paper throughout the process. However, I do shift and change and alter the pressure that I'm exerting and how much paper I actually cover up with my color, depending on whether I am working on darkest dark areas, whether I'm working on midtones, or whether I am trying to develop lightest lights or highlight areas. Because being able to develop different values, if you've checked out any of my past tutorials, is super important to me because I do like creating mid to higher levels of realism in my work, and being able to develop darkest darks and a wide range of midtones and lightest light areas is key in order to develop some sort of a three-dimensional look and depth in a piece. And if we always go in with a ton of pressure and always cover up all of our paper with a ton of color, most likely than not, that is going to lead to flatness. Just like when I'm working with regular watercolor paint, I never really bring in white. I like making use of the medium's translucency in combination with the whiteness and the lightness under that color to develop a wide range of values, to develop dimension and a sensation of light and glow. All right, so after having filled in my 12 rectangles, I then switched on over to using a paintbrush. This is me going in with a size 5 round brush. I dipped my paintbrush in my container of water. I removed the excess water by gently scraping the bristles of my paintbrush on the top of my container there. And you can see me constantly use my absorbent towel to stay on top of water control as well, because you really don't need very much water at all when you're using watercolor pencils. As long as your paintbrush is damp, you're good. And it's important to constantly blot the tip of your paintbrush or even the ferrule of your brush on your absorbent towel so that you don't go in with too much water and start losing control. So as you can see, what I am doing right here is I am just activating the right side of these rectangles. And I first get started with the top section with a little bit of water in my paintbrush. And then I remove the excess pigment and water from my paintbrush bristles by gently tapping the tip of my paintbrush on my absorbent towel. I go back in to activate the second section, and then I finally use the color in a very translucent state, just what is left behind after having done that second section. I paint in that bottom right section with just a little bit of pigment in my in my paintbrush. So hopefully you can see how that last little section that I paint in all of these rectangles right at the bottom, in which I am painting in the color in its most translucent state, just with the color that is left behind in my paintbrush bristles after having painted in those first two sections. That bottom section has no texture to it at all because no watercolor pencil application has been done with the pencil directly on paper. That application was done 100% using the pigment in its already diluted form and using a paintbrush. No prior application has been done on that paper, directly on that paper, using the pencil. So there is a way to use watercolor pencils in such a way that no texture is left behind. All right, so I just finished up with my swatching here. You can see how much more vibrant and in many cases how much deeper and darker these colors look once they've been activated with water. And also hopefully you can see how much the pressure and how much paper you cover with your watercolor pencils. These things have a huge impact on how light or dark the color looks. Alright guys, moving on to the next part of this video, in which I'm going to be sharing the 12 must-know watercolor pencil techniques that I would highly recommend you guys practice and explore on your own. I want to encourage you to try these along with me. Just separate your watercolor sheet into 12 sections or create 12 little rectangles the way that I did here. Alright, so with this first one, all I'm going to be doing is very similarly to what I was doing before with my swatching process. I'm going to cover different sections of this particular rectangle with my watercolor pencil with different amounts of pressure and coverage of that paper. Okay, so you can see how I started with a greater amount of pressure and more even coverage in that left little strip or left side, left third. Then in the center, I did a less amount of pressure and less coverage. And then on the right section, I did a less amount of coverage. I just covered it up in a looser way with that purple pencil. And then right here, what I am doing is I am taking it a step further and activating this bottom portion with water. I'm making sure to remove the previous amount of purple from my paintbrush bristles and dabbing my paintbrush on my absorbent towel before activating the next section and not just pulling the purple towards the right. So again, this is an excellent way to practice creating a wide range of different values, saturation of color to translucency of color using just one watercolor pencil. Moving on to the next watercolor pencil technique, and this one is applying watercolor pencil on dry paper and not activating it at all. You can certainly plan for some sections of your piece to use this technique in which you're not really activating that color with water at all. Moving on to the next watercolor pencil technique, in which we're going to be applying the color on dry paper, and this time we're going to be activating it with water. I always like making sure that I have a good amount of color laid down on paper before bringing in my water. And you're going to notice how I make sure to use my absorbent towel, dab those bristles on it before I go into this little rectangle to activate that color. So hopefully you can see how there is still some texture left behind even after having activated that color with water. This said, there is of course a less amount of texture than the rectangle on the left, the one with the blue that was not activated with water. All right, moving on to the next technique, and this one is going to be dry pencil on wet paper. So what we're going to be doing to explore this technique is we're going to be pre-wetting this little section of paper with clean water and our paintbrush, arrive at a nice even sheen in this little section with that water, and then we're going to explore just drawing a squiggly line in here and see what happens. So as you can see, certain sections of this orange squiggly line that I've drawn in look diffused out, they look partially blurred, especially those sections that were painted in on the sections of paper that were wetter. The water caused that pigment to bleed out a little bit. The line is not as sharp and defined as it would have been if I would have drawn it on paper that was dry. All right, moving on to the next technique. This is going to be wet pencil on dry paper. So what I am doing here is I am wetting the tip of this green watercolor pencil, and I am drawing the same squiggly line, only this time with green, in this new little rectangle. So you can see how certain sections of this line are a little bit more blurred out. They have a little bit more of a painterly look to them than other sections of this line, which were created by a slightly drier pencil tip. So it creates an interesting look throughout that line. There is a line weight variation throughout it. Certain sections are textured, others are more painterly. All right, moving on to the next, and this is wet brush on dry paper. So this is one of those techniques in which we're able to not have that texture left behind by our pencils at all. So what I did here was I applied my pencil on a scrap piece of watercolor paper, and I am using that as a sort of mixing palette, so to speak. I apply a good amount of color on there, and then I activate that color on that scrap piece of watercolor paper with my damp paintbrush, and then I bring out the color onto my watercolor paper that I'm working on. So as you can see, I have a completely painterly look to that color. There is no texture left behind because I didn't apply my color with my pencil at all. All right, so moving on to the next one, and this one is gonna be wet brush on wet paper. So we're gonna be able to create a kind of wet on wet effect, what we would call wet on wet when using traditional watercolor paint. So what we do here is, again, we apply the color separately on a scrap piece of watercolor paper, and again, we're gonna use that watercolor paper as a mixing palette, and we're gonna activate the color there and apply it from there. So what I'm doing right here is, again, I am pre-wetting this little rectangle with clean water. And once I have a nice even sheen all throughout, I am going to activate that red that I have prepared for myself on my scrap piece of watercolor paper, and I'm gonna drop it into certain sections in a very random, irregular way. And you can see the beautiful wet on wet, very painterly effect that I've created. Moving on to a gradient, and I would recommend using analogous colors in the color wheel for this little exploration here. And with analogous colors, all this means is they're just colors that are next to each other in the color wheel. So yellow and orange, or orange and red, or green and blue, or blue and purple. Anything like that is going to have a nice transition in between, because if you go for complementary colors, colors that are very different from each other or opposites in the color wheel, you may end up creating a color that you didn't necessarily want in the middle where they transition into each other. All right, so all I am doing right here is I picked a yellow and an orange, so analogous colors, and I am overlapping those colors a little bit right in the center. I want to make sure that I have enough color on my paper before activating this color at all. So I filled in that yellow section first, a little bit past that middle area so that I could make sure to have a central section in which I overlapped both colors. And then I went ahead and started in with my orange. After having placed my orange, I then went back to the yellow and did a little bit more of that overlapping of that lighter color in the central area. Right here, I am applying that same idea that I was mentioning previously in another part of this video, in which I'm gonna make sure to get started with activating the lighter color first and making my way towards the darker color. Why? Because if I had started the other way around and I had started with the orange and started pulling the orange into the yellow section, that orange most likely than not would have eaten up or overtaken or covered up all of the yellow. So you always want to make sure that you start with activating the lighter area first and then bringing that paintbrush into darker colors, or if you don't want those colors to mix together, make sure that you completely rinse out those paintbrush bristles in between your colors. All right, so the next technique is layering, and I'm just gonna pick a couple of analogous colors once again right here, and I'm just gonna do a little exploration, allow it to dry, and then I'll come back to it later to do a little bit more layering after everything has dried. Right here you can see how I've created a yellow shape first, and then I added a couple of green shapes on top of that yellow. Notice how even though this green that I've used is much darker than the yellow that I used underneath it, you can still see a bit of that yellow shining through from under that green. And if I had taken time to apply even more yellow on top of that green before activating that color, there would be more yellow visible. I'm gonna allow this to dry and come back to this one later so that I can show you what happens when I continue applying more green on this layer of green that I've already activated with water. All right, moving on to the next one. And with this one, we're going to be taking color from the pencil tip using our paintbrush, and then we're gonna be applying the color in that way. So what I did was I pre-wetted my paintbrush bristles with some water, I removed the excess water, and I then scribbled my paintbrush bristles on the tip of this purple watercolor pencil, just a bit, and then you can see how with just doing that one time, I was able to draw all of these painterly lines in this rectangle. So once again, because I did not apply that watercolor pencil directly on my paper, this looks like I just used regular watercolor paint because there is no texture to that at all. Moving on to the next technique, and this one is lifting. This one is super, super important. I oftentimes use it to remove some of that excess color from my paper when I feel I've flattened out an area too much, I've applied way too much color. It helps you fix areas, add a little bit more dimension back into your piece. Most likely than not, you're not going to be able to remove all of the color that you've laid down on your paper, but at least you're going to be able to remove some of it, lighten some areas back up, and make your mistake less noticeable. Okay, so I've created a couple of blue shapes here, and before moving on to anything else, I want to show you how I am able to pick up some of that color or erase some of that color back up with a regular graphite eraser. You're not going to be able to erase it after you've activated that color with water though. At least I have found that it's not possible. So you do want to make sure that if you're going to be using an eraser like I am doing right here, that you actually use it before bringing in any water. All right, so with this second shape, I'm actually going to be activating it, and I'm going to be doing some lifting using my absorbent towel. So much like when I am painting with regular watercolor paint, I make sure that I go in while that paint is still wet, and I can go ahead and do some lifting with my absorbent towel. Hopefully you can see right there how I was able to pick up quite a bit of that color, back up, and I've lightened certain areas. So this is something that I do when I've just applied way too much paint on paper and I've started flattening areas out. I'll do some lifting while that paint is still wet, and that will most likely fix the problem. All right, so moving on to the very last technique that I'm gonna be sharing with you today, and this one is dropping in teeny tiny pieces of sharpenings of that color on paper that is wet. So what you're gonna be seeing me do here is I am gonna use my crafting knife to very carefully just remove and sharpen off some pieces off those tips from a few of my watercolor pencils. I'm going to do this with a few different colors. I'll collect these sharpenings on the scrap piece of watercolor paper, then I am going to be moving on to pre-wet that section with clean water, and then I'm going to be dropping in the sharpenings onto that pre-wetted paper. Because that color has water-soluble binder in it, when I drop in these little pieces on paper that has been pre-wetted, that color is going to slightly bleed out, and I'm going to be left with a textured, mottled look. All right, I'm going to drop these in there. I'm going to allow everything to dry, and later on when everything is dry, I'm going to scrape a few of these pieces off. I have noticed that much like with the salting technique, the smaller, the teeny tinier those sharpenings are, the more they kind of bleed out and completely melt into that paper. All right, so in the meantime, I'm gonna go back to the layering rectangle. Everything is completely dry by this point. And what I'm gonna be doing is deepening and darkening certain green sections within this green shape that I've created on the right. So all I did was I did a little bit of overlapping of that dark green in the sections that I wanted to deepen and darken. And after having placed that color, I simply activated that color once again with my paintbrush and a bit of water. And right here on the left, what I did was I did a little bit more of that overlapping of that yellow in that central part to brighten that yellow section more. And you can see how at the end, these two shapes look very different. The one on the left looks a lot more yellow, a lot lighter, because I did more of that yellow overlapping in that central section. And I even pulled a bit of that yellow out towards the green with my paintbrush. Whereas with the green shape on the right, I didn't really do any overlapping with the yellow. I just placed green on top of that yellow. All right, so I'm just dusting off some of these sharpenings from my very last little exploration here. And you can see how once I removed the majority of those sharpenings, I was left with a mottled look, a textured look that was created with those yellow, orange, and red sharpenings. All right, so these are the 12 must-know watercolor pencil techniques that I wanted to share with you guys today. I hope that they were fun for you. I hope that you were able to give them a go for yourself. And just to finish up this video, I wanted to share my thoughts, my opinions, in terms of who I feel watercolor pencils are for and who they are maybe not as much for. So coming back to the idea of watercolor pencils being a combination of a drawing and a painting medium in one, I think it's just important to acknowledge the fact that if it is your goal to become a better painter, right? If it's your goal to learn how to handle paint and create paintings, then just using watercolor pencils for a very long period of time and only using pigment in pencil form and not a paintbrush, you could be progressing much more slowly towards your goals of becoming a painter. Personally, though I really enjoy watercolor pencils, I consider myself to be more of a painter than a drawer when it comes to using color, at least, because I really love using pen and ink and graphite for drawing and sketching. But when it comes to using color, I really like applying it with paintbrushes as opposed to a pencil form, okay? But that's just me. So I think that it is important to explore different mediums and come to a conclusion as to what your personal preferences and goals are. Do you consider yourself to be more of a drawer or more of a painter? And what are your goals for the future, right? And don't be afraid to push yourself with a medium or to start painting because you feel it's too hard, and stick to a medium because you feel it's easier, right? If you love watercolor pencils and that's what you want to become great at, then awesome. As I said in the beginning, go for it. But don't stay in the watercolor pencil phase because you're afraid of moving on to paint, or fall into thinking that it is exactly the same as using traditional paint, because honestly, it is not. It is not the same as using paint, and we have to be honest about the skills that we're developing here, and that's all I'm trying to say. Be honest about your personal goals and the skills that you're trying to develop, and then make sure that you are taking the bull by the horns, so to speak, to work towards your own personal goals. I love watercolor pencils because they're so interesting and so versatile, and I love having skills with them so that I can take them on trips or take them when I am going to be working in a coffee shop, or to bring in specific effects and specific paintings. But I know in my heart of hearts that I am a painter when it comes to applying color. And I wish that for you too. I wish that you're able to come to a conclusion as to what that is for you and what your mediums that you absolutely adore are. And what I hope for you guys is that you're not afraid of pushing yourself with the mediums that you're truly interested in. All right, so final thoughts in regards to watercolor pencils and watercolor paint. Depending on the artist's individual style and preferences, she or he may find one medium more enjoyable than the other. Personally, I wouldn't recommend watercolor pencils to artists that are specifically interested in more expressive painterly styles, who are perhaps more drawn to a paintbrush than to a pencil and to drawing. On the other hand, watercolor pencils may be very appealing to artists that enjoy a greater amount of control over their medium. Maybe for total beginners who are just starting to get comfortable with art creation or starting to learn about color, or for people who don't have much space to create art in because of their practicality. People who like to spend a long time adding detail into their work, mixed media artists who enjoy combining different mediums in one same piece or combining mark making techniques with more painterly techniques. And also, finally, artists who are much like myself, who like pushing themselves in different directions and expanding their skills with different mediums, because watercolor pencils are super, super fun. And I do believe that the skills that you develop with one medium, whether it's a drawing or a painting medium, they really expand your horizons and positively bleed into your skills with other mediums. All this said, I do feel that it is important to really acknowledge what we're truly passionate about, what those particular drawing and painting mediums are that we're most called towards. And sometimes that does require some exploration, of course, of different mediums. But once we've arrived at that, to really prioritize those mediums, because the more mediums we work with, the more diluted our effort and our focus become, right? And this means that we're going to progress much more slowly towards our goals if we don't have any priorities, if we don't have any specific goals. All right, my friends, that is going to do it for today's watercolor pencil guide. I hope that this was helpful for you. I hope that you learned something new, that you were able to give the technique exercises a go for yourself. And I'm definitely super excited to be creating more step-by-step tutorials on this awesome medium for you in the near future. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really, really hope you did. And if so, please make sure to check out everything that I'm offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you get immediate access to my most exclusive resources in the form of real-time, step-by-step, fully narrated tutorials that I don't share anywhere else. All of the tutorials that I share over on Patreon include my downloadable outline sketch, my high-resolution reference photos, and my supply lists, including the list of specific colors that I use for the piece on hand. Patreon community members also have access to my weekly sketchbook prompts, which are designed to help you stay consistent and making progress as an artist. There's also a library of classes on art fundamentals that now has over 20 classes in it, and that gets added to each and every month. Monthly live Q&A sessions with me, in which community members get to ask me anything they'd like, feedback from me on your work, and much, much more. So go ahead and check it out. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, so you can pick whichever one you need. I'm gonna make sure to leave a link to that down below in the description box. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you found some helpful nuggets in it, that you found it inspiring, and if you did, pretty please, I'd super appreciate it if you give this video a thumbs up and share with family or friends who you think would find it helpful as well. That really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and allows others to get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe so that I can see you next week for another video, and keep on creating. Bye guys!